The talent is there in droves, but who's going to step up? That is what needs to be sorted out in August camp in Columbus. We talk Ohio State football, and we break down the offense with Pat Murphy from Bucknuts, and encourage you to head on over there to check out his work at 247 Sports. Again, it's Bucknuts as Pat joins us on a regular basis. All right, Pat, appreciate you stopping by as always. How you doing today?
Good. Last time I was on here, we were talking more recruiting. Now we go back into kind of my wheelhouse, which is the team stuff. So hopefully I can revert my brain back to the guys that are already in the program as opposed to the guys they hope end up in the program.
All right, Pat. So we're going to hit you with question number one. Everybody wants to know this. Who's going to be the starting quarterback?
Yeah.
It's your wheelhouse.
Then,
so
yeah, right. I mean, I think everyone expects that it's going to be CJ Stroud. You know, I mean, anybody I talk to, whether it's in the media, fans, those stuff like that, you know, it seems to be that that's the direction things are pointing. What I think is important to point out is this race isn't over. And I think if Ryan Day knew for sure that CJ Stroud were the guy, he would have named CJ Stroud the quarterback. You know, it would have made things a little bit easier going into the summer. He could have led all of the workouts and things like that. But Ohio State's recruited two other talented quarterbacks that, while maybe are a little bit behind after the spring from everything we've heard, are still certainly in the running. Jack Miller, who was in the same class as CJ Stroud, was a freshman last year. Neither guy played a ton, but both guys did get into games. Neither threw a pass, but both did have a rushing touchdown and did step in. CJ Stroud was the guy who came in for Justin Fields when he took that big shot against Clemson for the one play, which maybe gives you an indication of who was listed as the backup, even though there wasn't an official depth chart put out. And then Kyle Mccord was a five-star prospect out of Pennsylvania. We'll talk about one of his high school teammates later, but they won a state championship last year in Pennsylvania at St. Joe's. So, you know, a five-star kid who's actually higher rated than either Miller or Stroud. So, you know, he's there. He had a good spring. I mean, Buckeye fans saw all three quarterbacks in the spring game, and we've kind of touched on their performances there in previous episodes. But, you know, I think that regardless of who wins this job, and I do think it'll be CJ Stroud, but regardless of who wins this job, I think all three guys are capable of leading this offense. You know, and it's a talented offense, as we'll touch on. But, you know, all three guys, I think, showed that they can make the throws, they can make good decisions. There's going to be growing pains. Let's be clear about this. This isn't Justin Fields coming in a couple of years ago as a sophomore and, you know, having had experience playing at Georgia. You know, he played in an SEC championship game, albeit in a limited role, but, you know, he got into some games and things like that. These quarterbacks don't have that experience under their belt. So there will be some growing pains. And with the way the schedule works, they don't have those early non-conference cupcake games that some quarterbacks, some teams in the past have had. You start on the road in the Big Ten at Minnesota. You have Oregon coming to Ohio Stadium in week 2. So these guys are going to have to be ready to go, whoever wins that job. I think that's part of the reason Ryan Day wants to make sure he's got the right guy. He's not rushing to make a decision because he knows, you know, you can't have a guy go on the road in the Big Ten and throw 3 interceptions and put your team in a bad spot and then come home against Oregon and maybe you're changing quarterbacks. No, let's find the right guy, I think, is their approach. And that probably will be CJ Stroud, and that probably will turn out to be a great decision. But they're going to finish this competition once fall camp starts.
And as Pat outlined, if you're a non-Ohio State fan that's just trying to get into the mix of this quarterback race, and if you're going to search for stats during garbage time, you're not going to find any. So this is the first time in 50 years at Ohio State that there is not a single pass that's been thrown by anybody on the roster. Nobody. I guess if they go to the single T, wing T, then CJ Stroud's got the edge from that 40-some yard touchdown run against Michigan State. But other than that, it's CJ Stroud's apparently the front runner, and I think that's pretty conventional wisdom right there. But certainly he cannot slip up because there are others waiting in the wings. And again, not a MAC school, an FCS opponent, anything like that early on to get comfortable with. It's Minnesota out of the gate on a Thursday night national TV, and then boom, against Oregon, an elite top 10 opponent in week 2, albeit at home. But if you look at the 3 in regards to arm strength, running ability, there is some difference and distinction there.
Yeah, certainly. And I think you saw that if you watched Ohio State's spring game. CJ Stroud was the quarterback that they allowed to kind of open up the playbook as much as any of the 3 did a lot of things that were reminiscent of what Justin Fields did. In fact, he ran a play that Ohio State ran a few times last year. The play that Chris Olave scored on right after Justin Fields got hurt. He came back in the game, was kind of a rollout to the right, throw a touchdown in the corner of the end zone. CJ Stroud ran that exact same play to Chris Olave in the spring game, and it looks like a carbon copy. He does a lot of things very similar. Kyle McCord may have the biggest arm of the three, maybe not quite as dual threat. Jack Miller doesn't get a lot of credit for his legs, but he's a guy who can move around in the pocket, keep plays alive. He'll pick up some yards if you have to. So, if you're looking for a Justin Fields type quarterback, I think that's definitely CJ Stroud. If you're looking for more of the Dwayne Haskins big arm, that might be a little bit more Kyle McCord, and then Jack Miller's kind of there in the middle. But as I said earlier, all three can do it. It's just you'd have to tailor the offense a little bit. Ryan Day's shown he could do that before, which is why I think they'd be comfortable with any of those three. You're just trying to find the best one at this point.
Please like the video, share the videos out on social media, because if you enjoy the content, others will as well. So please share the videos. And we got Pat Murphy on the line to break down the Ohio State offense. You can join Pat and the rest of the crew there at Bucknuts 247 Sports, of course. All right, why don't we go from the biggest question mark to the biggest certainty in regards to just not being solid, but being elite. It's pretty much a consensus opinion across the nation that this is the best wide receiver core in the nation, and certainly they can haul in a few errant throws if these quarterbacks aren't exactly on the money, because the waves and waves of talent and speed and size and just giftedness is ridiculous, starting with Chris Olave.
Yeah, it is. And Chris Olave, obviously the most experienced of the wide receivers at Ohio State, coming off a career high 50 catches, only played 7 games last year, missed 1 game with the COVID health and safety protocols, 729 yards, led the team with 7 touchdowns. A guy who wasn't super highly recruited, had to miss his junior year after transferring in high school. But the Buckeyes found a talented player, and that became evident pretty early on in his career. And he's just gotten better and better. A surprise, really, that he came back. He was a guy who probably could have gone pretty high in the NFL draft, but he said during the spring he felt like he had unfinished business at Ohio State. The thought is he wants to be the #1 receiver taken in the NFL draft. So come back for another year. Ohio State has gotten close with the national championship the last 2 years, including playing the title game last year. He wants to go out on top, and now he'll have another chance to do that. Garrett Wilson right behind him. Those were the 2 primary receivers for Ohio State last year. A lot of 2 tight end sets, so 2 wide receivers on the field. Wilson, 43 catches, 723 yards, and 6 touchdowns. A great sophomore year for him, obviously, as well. Those 2 guys, I broke it down for something I wrote earlier today. If you put them on a 12-game regular season pace instead of the 7 or 8 games that they played, they're both over 1,000 yards. And Ohio State's only had 5 receivers in history of the program reach that 1,000-yard mark. So to have 2 that were on pace to do it last year is pretty remarkable. And then you dig into the depth behind them. Not a ton of experience, but a lot of talent. Julian Fleming was the #1 receiver in the country in the 2020 class. Jackson Smith and Jigba was right behind him. G. Scott Jr. is a guy who did some stuff at tight end this spring and may end up staying at that position. So he's kind of a guy we can touch on at both spots. But all 3 of those guys should be able to make a bigger impact than they did as freshmen. They just didn't have the offseason and things to kind of get completely comfortable jumping from that high school offense to college offenses. And I think that's why the coaches didn't put them in a game a ton. And then you've got the freshmen that are coming in who will have a more normal offense. Starts with Emeka Egbuka, the #1 receiver in his class. So that's back-to-back #1 receivers with Julian Fleming for Ohio State. Marvin Harrison Jr., the son of Hall of Famer Marvin Harrison, who looks more the part than his dad did. He's 6'3", 6'4", and he's been out at some of those Ohio State camps. Looks like an NFL wide receiver build-wise already. And then Jaden Ballard is kind of, I don't want to say the forgotten guy at wide receiver in that class, but when you're coming into a class with so much talent, he hasn't been talked about as much, but a guy who certainly I believe will make an impact, maybe not as a freshman at Ohio State, but a top 15 receiver in the country in his class. So, that's what 8, 9 guys right there that I listed. It's, as you said, widely considered to be the top receiving core in the country. Now these guys have to go out and prove it. Other than Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, not a lot of experience, as I said. So, they've got to go do it for a young quarterback. So, you know what you've got with Garrett Wilson. You know what you got with Chris Olave. These other guys are very talented, but have to go out and make plays, and I believe that they will.
And just to extend on your 1,000-yard receiver narrative, Chris Olave, again, 50 pass receptions in 7 games. If Ohio State does what they did last year in a full season, which means you play in a conference championship game, you make it all the way to the national championship game. He plays 15 games. He catches over 100 passes when it's prorated. That doesn't happen at a place like Ohio State. I don't think it's ever happened. I think they're in the 90 catch range, like David Boston might have that record. And or maybe Terry Glenn or David Boston, I believe, has that record. But because, my goodness, there's just too many options, and they don't throw the ball every play, so it just doesn't happen at Ohio State. So Chris Olave, he just strikes me, and I'm no scout or coach, but more of the baller. You know, I guess I'm thinking back to the play he made against Michigan when he first hit the scene, where he caught some passes down the stretch and really asserted himself into the lineup in 2018. But he made the play on special teams with a block punt. Like, he's the kind of guy where that he could be placed anywhere on the field. You know, that you could put him at like safety and he's going to make plays. It just seems like he's just a gamer regardless. Where Garrett Wilson looks like the prototypical NFL receiver, like in the uniform and the way he runs the routes and catches the football.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you know, Chris Olave is still playing special teams, and I believe he probably will this year, even going into his senior year, which has kind of been a standard. Terry McLaurin did it. Paris Campbell did it. There's been a number of guys who have embraced that role, even when they become factors on either offense or defense. But the one thing I will say with Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, with those stats, you know, last year, obviously they focused so much on those guys. I think it was like 58% of the receptions went to those two and 69% of the receiving yard production. So I do think that usage rate is going to come down this year. I think other guys, you know, whether it be some of these other receivers, a couple tight ends we'll talk about in a minute, you know, there'll be more pass catchers getting more targets for Ohio State. But even if you bring that down some, you mentioned, you know, the potential of 15 games. I only looked at a 12-game regular season. You know, the numbers can still be ridiculous, especially if you have a quarterback that continues to get better and better throughout the year for both of those guys, while other guys start to emerge as well. So, you know, it's a scary thought for Ohio State even if these guys get, you know, upwards of 950 yards apiece in Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. You know, that's a pretty ridiculous year to have two guys at that point.
And we'll stay with the pass catchers, even though at Ohio State they're not necessarily pass catchers much. They still make their way off to the NFL, and Jeremy Ruckert's the next one in line.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, he has a case, and I think he'll try and make it this year to be the best tight end in the country. As you mentioned, other schools tend to use the tight ends in the passing game more. I do think Ohio State will get Jeremy Ruckert more involved. You think back to the college football playoff last year, and, you know, obviously that was exposing some matchups, maybe things that Clemson, Alabama weren't expecting, going to Jeremy Ruckert and Luke Farrell, who is one of those tight ends you mentioned that did get drafted despite not being a heavy pass catcher. But Jeremy Ruckert's coming off a 13-catch season, 151 yards, 5 touchdowns. And, you know, for a shortened season, that's pretty good numbers for an Ohio State tight end. I think he can be a major factor. This was a kid who was a wide receiver in high school, always projected as a tight end at the next level with his frame and his build. But, you know, he had to work on, more than anything, the blocking side of things when he got to Ohio State. So he's going to be the number one. Behind him is kind of a question mark. Cade Stover, who came to Ohio State as a linebacker, has now moved back to offense. He's playing tight end. Did so last year, didn't play a ton. He's probably the number 2 guy, and I think he's probably more in the mold of that blocking tight end. But I mentioned G. Scott Jr. earlier. He's a guy who can potentially come in and give another option as a receiver. You know, grew up as a receiver, still a big body guy. And behind them, they have, you know, a couple guys, young guys who can probably just fill in for depth. But I think mostly you're going to see Jeremy Ruckert and Cade Stover out there, Jeremy Ruckert being primarily the receiving tight end. And, you know, I also imagine you'll see less 2 tight end sets from Ohio State just because of the number of receivers that they've got. So Jeremy Ruckert may be the guy on the field the most this year. And I think he can have, you know, a pretty good season. It's been a long time since you've had anyone get close to 30 catches at a tight end position for Ohio State. I'm not sure that he'll get that many, but I think he can have get in the conversation for an All-American type year.
Got Pat Murphy on the line from Bucknuts 247 Sports, breaking down the Ohio State offense for us. as we move to the running back position. Much like the wide receiver position, there's depth, incredible depth, but maybe not necessarily the elite proven players. At least there's two coming that Buckeye fans hope are elite, but it starts with Master Teague at this point.
It does. And he was the guy who was the starter for most of last year in a rotation with Trey Sermon. Both guys were playing for much of the season, but at the end of the year, it was Master Teague who suffered a concussion. Trey Sermon took over in the Big Ten championship game, ran from there, only really came out of a game because he got hurt against Alabama, and Master Teague had to come in and kind of carry the load there. Master Teague's numbers are good. They're just not elite. And I think you've come to expect a standard from Ohio State running backs where, you talk about Ezekiel Elliott, Carlos Hyde, J.K. Dobbins. I mean, you can go back way further than that, obviously, but those three come to mind in recent years. And Master Teague just hasn't looked the part of those guys. He did to some degree a couple of years ago when he was the backup to J.K. Dobbins, but that was often against, tired second string defenses late in games. 514 yards on 104 carries last year, so 4.9 yards per carry, 8 touchdowns, as we mentioned. Sort of lost his job due to injury. I think a full offseason is going to help him. I just don't know if he is going to prove to be the guy. It would not surprise me if he got the first carry of the year, for several carries even. But there's definitely talent behind him. You mentioned the two young guys in Travion Henderson and Evan Pryor, who are true freshmen. Both were here in spring. There's a lot of excitement around them, but those guys have to prove not only that they can carry the ball and do the things needed, but hold on to the ball. Ball security is such a big deal. And then pass blocking. At Ohio State, you need to be able to do all three of those things. So it's going to be interesting. But the other names to know: Steel Chambers, Marcus Crowley. Marcus Crowley probably more likely to be able to step in and contribute right away. He's a guy I think could vie for a rotational position with the Buckeyes. He was injured last year after tearing his ACL late in his freshman year. Got back to full health. We saw him a little bit against Alabama in the national championship game. So he's a guy who I'm interested to see because he did look good as a freshman, could kind of give you something different than Master Teague as some of the young guys come along. So it'll be interesting. They could do a kind of a platoon of 3-4 guys, especially early in the year, unless one guy steps out during fall camp and kind of wait to see if you can find that bell cow running back.
And Henderson and Pryor, in addition to their running skills, did show us in the spring game and also have the reputation coming from high school that they're advanced beyond their years in regards to pass catching out of the backfield. Yes. Pat Murphy on the line, Bucknuts 247 Sports. Join him and the rest of the staff there. Join us here at the Voice of College Football for Ohio State football coverage and college football coverage every day. All right, let's hit the offensive line. Of course, they make it all work. And two really good players in Wyatt Davis and Josh Myers move on. Two elite players are on the flanks in Thayer Munford and Nicholas Petit Freyr when we look at Ohio State's offensive line. And maybe not to the degree of the wide receiver core, but if you look across national publications, typically Ohio State's ranked number 1 or at least 2 or 3 in terms of offensive lines.
Yeah, that should certainly be the case this year. Ohio State, I think Pro Football Focus has put out a handful of things about Ohio State's offensive line and where it ranks nationally. You mentioned the two tackles. Thayer Munford came back for a 5th year. Nicholas Petit Freyr is here for his, I think he's a redshirt junior this year. Two guys who, especially in Thayer Munford, have a lot of experience. He's at left tackle. Nicholas Petit Freyr started at right tackle last year. Arguably the two of the best tackles in the country. So good news for a young quarterback to have both sides protected. The question will be in the interior of the line. There's a lot of talent there. We saw Harry Miller last year play guard. He was a center they recruited him to play center, was the backup to Josh Myers a couple of years ago. Up and down year, playing guard for the first time in college. Whether he moves back to center or stays at guard is a question. And then names to know: Matthew Jones, Luke Weipler. Does Matthew Jones play at the guard? He can also play center. Luke Weipler could play at center. So there's certainly options on this offensive line and some young guys that could emerge as well. But, the talent is there. It's just kind of figuring out the pieces. And I mentioned Harry Miller. He didn't partake in spring practice due to an injury. Offensive line coach Greg Studrawa did say, however, that he expects him to be one of those top 5. And one guy I haven't even mentioned yet who I think will still be a part of the offensive line is Dejuan Jones, a guy who was a 3-star recruit, a huge human, 6'7", I believe. Yeah, 6'8", 360 pounds is what he's listed at on the Ohio State roster. Came in, they thought he was kind of a project guy a couple years ago, ended up playing some. And from my understanding, they have talked with him about, we want to kind of rotate you in with the tackle positions, get you some more experience so that you can be the guy next year when Thayer Munford's definitely gone. Nicholas Petit Freyr could potentially be gone. So you may see some rotation on the offensive line, which isn't normal. Not a lot of programs do that. You want to get set with your offensive line. But, if you have the confidence in these guys to all three be able to do it at the tackle spots, I think that's a way to kind of keep everyone happy there and get everyone playing time. And as I mentioned, that gets Dejuan Jones experience for, assuming next year he is one of the starters at those tackle positions.
Pat, it seems like it's going to be a situation where you can't necessarily at the end of the campaign look at the Ohio State stat sheet on offense, look at all the individual numbers, look at the final totals, which could be number one in the Big Ten pretty much across the board, and say, this was a great offense. They got the job done. All the questions were answered. It's going to be more like, do they execute in difficult situations? Are they going to be pressed against Penn State, Indiana, Oregon in particular? And is this offense going to execute and not just rack up 50 points against the lesser teams in the league, but are they going to be able to execute against the better defenses in the league and then hopefully in postseason competition?
For sure. And I think that'll be similar to last year. That will be the bar. Does Ohio State win the Big Ten again? Do they make the college football playoff again? I think the defense has a lot of questions to answer. The offense is, at least at this point, where I think you could see carrying the team. So yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that Ohio State will put up big numbers against, some of the, inferior Big Ten teams, so to speak. But it's staying focused to make sure that you get to where you want to go, and then handling your business against those other top teams in the Big Ten. And Indiana on the road, which will be interesting. That could be a game where, like last year, it's a bit of a shootout back and forth to some degree. So yeah, this offense is going to have to prove itself in the games that matter, because the numbers are going to be there. I mean, statistically, I think this will be up there with one of the best Ohio State offenses. Ryan Day and the rest of his staff have proven that they can, figure out ways to get the best out of these players, and certainly they have the talent. But it's doing it against other teams that have like talent that is going to be the big question for Ohio State.
Absolutely. Unless things just completely go off the rails unexpectedly. Yeah, the numbers are going to be crazy, but is there a 2-minute drive during this season that's going to be the difference between a playoff appearance and not facing, let's say, most likely CJ Stroud? All right. Good look at the Ohio Sate offense, loaded with talent. Pat Murphy on the line from Bucknuts 247 Sports. Joins us on a regular basis to help break down the Buckeyes. Pat, we always appreciate it. Great conversation, and thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Anytime.